I want to thank President Morishida for being the host of this conference of the California Community Colleges and UC and the California State University system. It's great to see you all here, and it's great to see the excitement that you all bring to this conference. My job at this point in the agenda is to introduce our next speaker, and it's very good that Leroy actually gave a very good start of that introduction, because now I'm just going to fill in a few blanks. For over 40 years, William Massey has been a professor, consultant, vice provost for research, acting provost, and vice president for business and finance at Stanford University, during which time he developed and pioneered the financial planning and management tools that President Morishida was just describing. And I can tell you, Leroy is not the only one who has been a follower of Dr. Massey's. So have I over the decades, and so have really, literally hundreds of business and financial officers. He really did develop tools that have become standard for all of us in terms of modeling and data collection and using this in a kind of a business analytics mode. While a professor of higher education at the Graduate School of Education at Stanford, he worked on resource allocation, cost containment, and mathematical modeling, and academic quality assurance and improvement. From 1996 to 2002, Dr. Massey co-directed the Department of Education's National Center for Post-Secondary Improvement. He served on Hong Kong's University Grants Committee from 1991 to 2003, and since 2010 has been an honorary fellow at the University of Melbourne's Graduate School of Education. Dr. Massey holds a PhD in economics, a Master of Science in Management from MIT, and a Bachelor of Science from Yale University. After founding the Stanford Institute for Higher Education Research in 1988, his research focused on institutional strategy, faculty roles and responsibilities, resource allocation, processes, and universities as systems. Today, Dr. Massey is presenting on the topic, Mind the Gap, Getting Actionable Data on Teaching Activities and Costs. You've all heard about the triple threat. I think he's actually a quadruple threat. Please join me in welcoming Dr. William Massey.
Take just a moment to get organized here because I too tried the Mike Redmond strategy. I arranged for my allergies to kick in this morning. Unfortunately, they or fortunately or whatever, they aren't quite bad enough to keep me off, but I may have to stop and take a cough drop or a glass of water or something. Anyway, as has been said, I 40 years on the Stanford payroll. The problem was I couldn't keep a job. I mean, first assistant, associate full professor, then vice provost for, associate dean of the business school, then vice provost for research, then acting provost. Couldn't continue there because the provost came back from sabbatical, darn it. And then vice president for business and finance, essentially in today's terms, I guess, executive VP. And then back to teaching again, and now the last decade or plus I have been consulting. So anyway, what I want to do today is to share some recent work that I've been doing with some others. The point of view I want to take is one that spans the gap, to get to that, between the academic side of the institution and the business side of the institution. I love the reference to business side is where the power is. That reminds me of Bill Gates in Nashville a month or so ago, who basically said to the NACUBO annual meeting, he said, universities need to be the agents of change in their institution because they're the ones that are willing and know how to change. And there are some others that are sort of less likely to do that. He said business officers need to become, in effect, revolutionaries. And that means working in a lot of different ways. I mean, you can't just go out and do it straight on. I mean, there are political issues, there are real substantive intellectual issues, and so on. But the business officers should be proactive across the activities of their institutions. The reason for the title, I mean, teaching, I mean, what do business officers have to do with teaching? It is the business of the business, of course, in our institution. It reminds me of the line in Casablanca, you know, the movie Gambling in Casablanca, teaching in universities. But that is, of course, why we're here, one of the major reasons why we're here, along with research. Business officers, when you think about it, the people like yourselves, I mean, some of you will become, in fact, presidents and chancellors. We have a good example of that. But everybody is in a position to influence the direction of their institutions. Let me just illustrate that briefly. And I might add that influence could be either positive or negative. Back at Stanford in the day when new approaches to teaching and learning were just emerging, and it was exciting, and it involved some new technology and some new ways of organizing things, a professor tried to change his classes in some significant ways, and I was working on this sort of stuff then, and so we were in touch and talking. And he was blocked by who else? The administration, the registrar, in fact, and the facilities people. So he wanted to change a schedule, and with a certain amount of enough lead time, and said, no, the schedule is what it is. 3 times a week, lectures, the breakout section. It's just basically the reason it is too much trouble to accommodate your changes of putting things together in a different schedule. And so he's got a billion things to do. He's doing his research and all of that, so he didn't innovate. Well, actually, that guy, his name is John Etchemendy, and some of you may know he's the provost at Stanford now, so possibly the registrar is more responsive. Anyway, Stanford is, in fact, making a big effort in this space. So anyway, that's why I think it's important that we think beyond our normal sort of business routines and move on to and include what we're talking about here. Mind the gap. That's a sort of strange thing. What is this? Well, you know, anybody who's been to London knows this one. It means don't slip down the gap. Somebody did in England not too long ago, because it's the gap between the subway trains and the platform. But it's not just London. This is Shanghai. There, if you can see the Chinese characters. This is Hong Kong. Notice how polite they are. Please mind the gap. And then the others are from, I guess, England probably. Anyhow, that seemed to me to be a sort of a good way to start, because what we're going to be talking about here is a kind of business process re-engineering, if I may use that term, something that we did back at Stanford during my day on the business side of the house, but it's taking off slowly on the academic side. It is, with something called course redesign, and of course the MOOCs and all of that are major re-engineering efforts, and they are promising. But what I want to do now is talk about it more broadly in terms of the teaching side, and not just something that is radical a change as the MOOCs. I want to talk about it in terms of the mainline activity. But the problem is there are some gaps that are sort of holding us up in our ability to think about that. What they are, well, some of you may be familiar with Clay Christensen's work, since we were speaking of MOOCs a minute ago. Clay is a Harvard Business School professor, and he writes about disruptive innovation. And disruptive innovation is one that really bounces the system out of its established path and sets it on a new path. There's lots of innovations within the existing paradigm, but Clay is talking about innovations that are outside that. And that's what we need, actually, in universities. He tells the story of DEC, Digital Equipment Corporation, and this is something that needs to give us pause, I think, in universities. DEC, those of you who are nearer to my generation, perhaps remember them as the company that popularized the mini computer. They bounced IBM out of its mainframe hegemony, and they dominated the market in minis. But then the microcomputer came along, and some of you may remember the PET computers, these little things. Toys, the people at DEC said, toys, Bloomin' toys. They will never go anywhere. And this illustrates a very important point that Clay makes, that when a new innovation comes on, and I'm going to put MOOCs in this category at the moment, they are initially serving the underserved. That is, they are serving a population that are not making it with the established paradigm. And of course, we have many such populations in higher ed, including many on our own campuses. And I don't have to list them, you know who they are. When the new innovation starts off, the disruptive innovation starts off, it is serving the underserved because the well-served are in fact being served. You don't need so much innovation, maybe things around the edge, but serving the underserved, because nobody really knows how to do that, they usually are lousy in terms of their performance. The only good thing you can say about the disruptive innovation at the beginning is because they're serving the underserved, they are providing a service that wasn't heretofore available. That's good. But DEC looked at these pet computers and these little things, and they said, no threat. They talked to their customers who are the big Fortune 500 companies, and they said, DEC, you're doing just fine. Don't play around with that. These little things, these microcomputers, but they got better and better and better. But the customers, the established customers that were using minis for their business processing, all of the IT stuff that we're familiar with now, they continued to tell DEC that right up until they switched to the micros. And in the space of 6 months, DEC's stock tanked. The company practically, it survived barely, practically went out of business. And the mini computer was never again a force in the marketplace. And they did not see it coming. And that's Clay's point with respect to higher education. That's why that's the crevasse that he thinks we're at the edge of. So we've got to innovate, we've got to change, we've got to beat these disruptive innovations, and we've got to, basically take them on. But we have to do so in ways that don't undermine our basic academic values. As a professor, as I mentioned, a Yale graduate, I believe very strongly in undergraduate, on-campus undergraduate education for those to whom it can be made available. That doesn't mean everybody, because it just doesn't work for everybody financially or in terms of life situation and so on. But for those it can, it is really a better alternative than the strictly online. That doesn't mean online within undergraduate on-campus education is inappropriate. It's very appropriate, as we'll see. But it's the idea of on-campus education is tremendously important, and so how can we solve these problems without underlying those basic values of a student and a professor talking across a table and getting the kind of learning that is possible to get in that situation? Well, it turns out there are 3 kinds of gaps that we have to mind, that we have to go over. There are holes. Holes in what we know about teaching activities and their costs. And what are some of those? First of all, there's no systematic data on what actually happens by way of teaching. And for the most part, I'm now talking about traditional teaching, professors teaching students, lectures, labs, seminars, breakout sections, all the stuff we're familiar with on our campus. Nowadays, it may include some online elements as well, and I include those by reference, but the examples are mostly the traditional ones because they are mostly what we do. So there's no systematic data on that. How they differ across various campuses and departments, how they change over time. And furthermore, there's no data on the cost, either the full cost, the direct cost, or the incremental cost of teaching. Your governor, I understand, and her legislature is sort of sniffing around and saying they want much better costing data, down to the course level, I guess, from what I have heard. They're certainly at a fairly micro level. Why? Well, it may seem kind of intrusive and silly, but in fact, if you really want to understand the system and innovate and optimize, you have to have data at that level. There's just no way around it. So anyway, we have gaps in our data, and those gaps, those shortfalls, have inhibited the development of all sorts of things that are important to us, plans, budgets, and so forth. The second gap, and there are 3 in total, the second of 3, is that there are walls. You see a pattern here. There's holes, there's walls. And there is a wall, in fact, and I say this based on experience and a certain amount of research and certainly the literature in higher education, walls between the academic and financial people, and that these walls do, in fact, block a better understanding and the kinds of change that we need. Now, you probably knew that when you got up this morning. And let me just say that I'm well aware of the difficulties of talking to our academic colleagues. I was one, for a long time. I'm well aware of those difficulties with talking to them about the cost of what they do or the details of what they do. They don't exactly welcome you with open arms when you initiate that conversation. So I want to come back to that. It's funny. Higher education is the only industry, and in quotes, I don't mean to say we're a manufacturer. I think we're the only group of activities I know where most of the people responsible for designing, delivering the most important output, namely the teaching of students, and research is important too, yes, I know, they don't consider cost to be central in what they do. Faculty, and I taught for decades at Stanford, I wasn't conscious of what the cost of what I was doing was. I had a certain number of resources my department had. I did the best I could with them. I didn't go and try to optimize performance versus cost. Never crossed my mind to do it. But we're the only, just about the only industry now, certainly the only major one, where that's true. Think about it. It's not even true in healthcare anymore. It used to be true. It's not anymore because of the resource constraints and the tremendous needs. And furthermore, there is this deep cultural divide. And so we need to find ways to bridge that gap. I just note that despite goodwill, and there is a lot of goodwill on both sides, the divide has, over the decades, significantly impeded progress, and it does to this day. The third is what I would call spaces. Holes, walls, spaces between potential partners for benchmarking and the sharing of best practice. Now, the things we're talking about here, the kinds of activities that go on in teaching and the cost of teaching, there is no apparent absolute right answer to these things. I mean, you look at some numbers, you look at some patterns, you look at some data, and there are certain things you look at and say, yeah, that's good or that's not good. But this is not one of them. The only way you can make judgments about this stuff is to compare it with what other people are doing. And not just the numbers, you have to know what they're doing. So if there's a difference between benchmarking, the American Productivity and Quality Center used to stress this difference, a difference between benchmarking and benchmarks. Benchmarks are data. And we are getting to be better and better at using data, certainly on the business side of the enterprise are doing that. Benchmarking takes that one step further. It's a process, and it means understanding what the other people are doing. So you can interpret the data, and furthermore, so that you can get good ideas about how to take what they're doing and apply it to what you're doing. I think it's called shared services, or something like that, related to that anyhow. We need to do those things, but there's been a combination of organizational distance, which this conference, among others, is working very hard to overcome here in California, but also inadequate data structures. You need to have things well organized. You have to have the data under control and the right commonality of data structures and so forth in order to make this kind of sharing work. And I want to talk about that. There's also, and this is the elephant in the room whenever you start talking about teaching, the lack of robust criterion-referenced measures of quality. I mean, we've always felt that, gee, if only we had some, we'd be able to do so much more. If only we could tell, if you made a change in the way something is taught, how that affected the amount of learning. And there's been a lot of effort over the years on that. There's, various efforts to produce metrics and this and that. The National Center for, the National Academy of Sciences, National Research Council, convened a panel a couple of years ago on measuring productivity in universities, in higher education. I happen to serve on that panel. And we concluded after about a year and a half of holding hearings and thinking, and it had some pretty good people on it, the conclusion was that there are no adequate quality metrics, no metrics adequate to make a quantitative adjustment to productivity statistics, which all economists know is important if you're going to really measure productivity. There are no such measures now, and there won't be anytime soon, no matter what is said politically about rating systems and ranking systems and one-size-fits-all tests, and all we need is the magic bullet. There ain't no magic bullet, and it's not even in sight. Never say never, but it's certainly not on the horizon. So that's we just have to work with that. It's like the lack of resources compared to what we think we need. It's not going to change. We just have to work. We have to keep working on the problem, but we just have to go forward with it. I think in California, your institutions, the three systems that are represented here, you're really in a terrific position to make some progress on this. And that's where I want to end up this at the end. So it's time to fill in those holes. Remember Reagan at the Berlin Wall. Fill in those holes. Tear down the wall, Mr. Gorbachev. Traverse those spaces. So how do we do? How can we start? Let me describe a teaching activity model that I think can help at least start this process. And it's one the business side has a stake in, and so does the academic side. There's now big enough data to do what I'm describing. Back when I wrote that book with Dave Hopkins, there wasn't enough data. There were models of the general kind I'm going to talk about that tried to do these things, the so-called RRPM and the campus model. Some of you are old enough to remember those. They never worked very well. And the reason was the data just didn't exist to do better. And there's always in model building, it's always a kind of balancing act between what can be done and what should be done, and it just wasn't there at that point. We need something that's called a structural approach. And that's because of this quality issue, and I'll come to that in a second. And that's something that has to have value for everyone. That is, there has to be value in it for the business side of the enterprise, and there has to be value in it for the academic side, because that's the only way we're going to get this job done. And on the academic side, it's resource allocation, departmental planning, things of that sort, and you can certainly imagine what they are for the business side. What I'm going to describe has been developed combination of foundation-funded research, Lumina Foundation, Gates Foundation, mainly Lumina, and also some commercial R&D, which I'll describe. Okay, so let's describe that model, and I'm going to be fairly brief, and it sort of verges on maybe what looks like a little kind of technical, but I'm not really trying to give a technical description, and I just want to demonstrate. Some of you may be interested and want to follow specifically, but it's mainly to show that there is a logic here. It's not very complicated. It's certainly well within our grasp to get. So here's the logic. The model's going to connect certain drivers, namely enrollments, to resource requirements. For example, faculty FTEs. Those are both important things for budget models, right? And so these models do that. And they do it, as we'll see, at quite a micro, bottom-up, robust kind of way. The model's evidence-based, and it's driven specifically by data, and the structure is also informed by evidence. And very importantly, it's populated 99% by the campus transaction systems. There's been lots of efforts to go out and collect de novo data, custom data, to build these models from the departments, the academic departments. It doesn't really work. So the requirement and the fact of this, it's based on stuff that's already in the system. It's structural. And what that means here, a second reference to it now, is that it depicts causal relationships. A model can't replicate cause, but it can certainly describe causal relationships. That's what these models try to do. And the variables need to be understandable and relevant. The model is not a black box, because if it's a black box, people won't understand it, they won't use it. It's going to include various performance metrics in addition to costs, which turns out to be very important. There is a class of models which are generally what you might call non-structural models, which are now fairly widely used for benchmarks, as benchmarks in teaching cost. And I just want to describe how those fall short in comparison to the kind of thing that we're talking about this morning. The so-called single-factor productivity ratios, cost per student credit hour, I think we're all pretty familiar with, and student credit hours per faculty FTE. There's many variations on these themes, but the University of Delaware produces data. You can go on the web and get it, and you can get comparator groups of campuses, and it's quite a refined thing, and it's good. I mean, I'm all for it. But it's good, but it's not good enough, is the problem. And let me just show you very briefly why it's not good enough. And this is important because when you get into a political discussion, you have to be able to make these kinds of arguments. So suppose now you've got a variable or a model which is student credit hours, measuring student credit hours per faculty FTE. And that's a very commonly used one. So supposing you now find that for a given department that your measure is above its benchmark. You've got more cost, or I'm sorry, you're producing, not cost, this is credit hours. The same argument works the other way too, but your department is producing more credit hours per faculty FTE than the benchmark. And you've done a very careful job of getting the right comparative campuses and so on and so forth. The point is, you still don't know what it means. Does it mean that you're really productive? Well, maybe. Does it mean that the output, the learning is of low quality? Well, maybe. Does it mean that the research has gone into the tank? I mean, faculty are not having the time they need to do their research. Well, you just don't know, do you? Or is the workload unsustainable? People are doing all of the first three things. They're being productive, they're producing good quality, they're doing their research, but they're burning themselves out. And as soon as that can't go on forever, either the good people will leave or something will happen. So the point is, when you see something is above its benchmark, you don't know. And it matters. Which of these is the case? It matters. It matters a lot. Conversely, just the opposite side of that coin, if you're below the benchmark, it could be any of these things. Free riding, by the way, is that there are people that are just not pulling their weight. The classic example is the professor's tending his garden, or whatever. But that doesn't happen very often, but it does happen sometimes. The point is you just don't know. And this is the problem with a simple model, single ratio model. Structural models of the kind I'm going to describe are designed from the ground up. You can't bolt this onto a single ratio. You can't reverse engineer the single ratio to get at what you need to get out. You got to design it from the ground up. So how do we do that? Before we do, though, let me just describe what I call as the English story, not the English patient, but in a way it's a patient, I guess, but the English story. I was called as a consultant, I don't know, it's 10 years or so ago maybe, to a campus. It was a good public university, happened to be the flagship of the state. It was not a big state, actually, but it was had a proud tradition, I was working for the CFO and pretty close to the provost as well, so I said, we have we've been seeing the English department's cost per credit hour going down. They were under tremendous budget pressure, by the way. If you can believe it, it makes California look relatively easy in comparison. This state has frugality, takes it to a really fine art. Anyway, they'd been hammered budget-wise for a long time, and no sign. So they said, come on in, and we want, what my assignment as a consultant was find out what this department, had to be the English department, what are they doing so we can replicate it across the campus? Not an unreasonable question, kind of a benchmarking question, I guess. So I did. And the campus, I've already said this, but put heavy emphasis on productivity due to appropriation cost. Looked very good. There's the cost per credit hour going down, down, down. Well, what did I find? when I went. This was not rocket science. I just went out and talked to people. Imagine that. Good heavens. And I talked to the faculty out there, and what I found was that class sizes got bigger. There were lots more use of adjunct faculty. I mean, like the numbers had gone from 30% to 70% or something in the English courses. Less assigned writings. I said, well, look, we don't have the resources to grade these damn things, so we aren't assigning them. Multiple choice exams, same thing. This is an English department, for God's sakes. I mean, and so this I couldn't help wondering why these two senior administrators, who are very good people, by the way, but why they hadn't found this out. I mean, they should have talked to I talked to the dean too. He really wasn't aware of it. What planet do these people live on? But anyhow, the department had kept hammering away. We need more money. We need more money. Da 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 da. And it was always, well, we can't afford it. Could never happen here in California, of course. So you just have to make do with what you have, and they did. And actually, they'd done a incredible job of making do with what they had. There are just things you cannot overcome. So anyway, this is the poster child for the. So that was when I started asking myself, what kind of data system, if this campus had it? What kind of model, and model builders, what kind of model would have provided early warning of this, would have given people across the campus a chance to see it as it was developing, would have provided evidence that might have bolstered the budget requests for this department, and recognize everything is tight, but this was intolerable as it turned out. Anyhow, so the answer was you needed some kind of model. So it turns out that you need a model of the kind we're going to talk about. It turns out that there is a wealth of data, and this is kind of looking, you look at stuff that's hiding in plain sight. Timetabling data, student registration data, HR data, who's teaching what, facilities data, where things are scheduled, and and so on and so forth. That's all out there. We all know about it, and with the right kind of system, you can extract that information. It's not 100% accurate. We know timetables change and so forth, but it's mostly accurate. We do register students, and they do attend classes, and the classes mostly meet when they're supposed to, and stuff like that. So the data are already there. And what we could get out of that are enrollments, things like the enrollments, the numbers of sections, enrollment in each section, the contact hours, because the timetabling shows that, the teacher profiles, it shows who's teaching what kinds of courses, mostly. I know there's last-minute changes and to be determined and to be announced and stuff, but it gives you a reasonably decent view of it. Since the scheduling system knows where, what room it is, there's another data element out there that says how big that room is, and with a little work, most campuses can extract that information. So anyway, the data are there. That's what I mean by existing transaction. They didn't have to collect, you don't have to collect one whit of additional data. So what you really want to do is you want to summarize the results for the various departments in terms of variables like course level, lower division, and broken down. And you could tell from the catalog, by the way, is it a lower division? Does it start with a 1 or a 2 or whatever your system is, or is it a 3 or a 4, or is it a graduate or whatever? And then there's some course categories. I'll come back to that in a minute. But the most obvious one is some courses have lectures or big classes and breakouts, and it's important to keep track of those. So primary section is the plenary session. In some courses, that's all there is. But some courses have also breakout sections. Those are secondary sections. And there are some other groupings which I'll illustrate in a minute. And then for each course level and category, categories are all of these things, you want to calculate the number of sections you need, the number of sections you provide, which should be equal at the end of the day if the system is working. And you set the supply equal to the demand, and then there are certain business rules that you can put in place to sort of fill in some gaps. Let me just illustrate, sort of show that very, very briefly. The basic model. There will be, I promise you, there will be no quiz, multiple choice or otherwise, on this. But it just kind of says this is not rocket science. This is the kind of level of math problem that you might see in freshman high school, something like that. I've seen it recently with grandchildren. I had some trouble actually with some of their. Anyhow, that's. And I'll just decode those. There's a glossary. If you look back at this online, there's a glossary at the end. I won't bother with it. NCS, number of class sections. That's the total enrollment in the course divided by the average class size, right? Very complicated formula. Then you've got, that's the demand for sections. The supply is, again, it's the same number of class sections. Supply is the number of faculty FTEs times the average teaching load, courses per semester or year, or however you set it up, plus other teaching. Read that as adjuncts or whatever. And you can have multiple categories of other teaching. Just a brief summary. So all of this is pretty straightforward. Supply equals demand. You stick this NCS equal to that NCS. You turn the algebra crank a little bit, and you come out with this little formula, which I just put down to show you can do it, but it's it gives you the student-faculty ratio, which is something we always look at, which is a non-structural concept, but it gives it to you in terms of structural variables, things that you can do something with: average teaching load, the fraction of classes taught by adjuncts, which is what's defined out here on the right. And this is kind of a useful little formula when you try to deconstruct a student-faculty ratio, just that simple little thing. You can then now start calculating trade-offs among these policy variables: the student-faculty ratio, the average class size, the average teaching load, the fraction of adjuncts. So you're beginning to get some actionable variables. These are, in principle, they are actionable variables. And you do this at the department level to start with. So now, courses, what about that elephant that was grazing here the last time we looked in this room, the quality of education? Well, it turns out that, we'll see in just a second, you could get some insight about some aspects of the quality of teaching from the data that are already up here, and I'll illustrate that in just a second. In other words, you can get some evidence of the kind that would have been useful in diagnosing the English problem. Turns out also when you start looking at the registration data, many campuses have something about attrition during the course. And that's a big problem in many of our institutions. It's the day 10 enrollment, the beginning of the semester, and the enrollment just before the exam or something. And so you can put that in the system. And you can also put the number of failures in it and failing grades and so forth. So it's all there in principle. By looking at average teaching load, trends of that over time, you can make some inferences about the faculty's ability to do research. And you can then connect that up. I don't illustrate that, but you can connect that up with things like publications and citations and so on, if you want to. And there are a number of campuses beginning to do that. So you could close the loop and get to research and scholarship as well as teaching. So basically, just these simple concepts allow you to produce a serious model. You could add money to it. You can estimate the direct teacher cost just by applying the cost per faculty member, per hour, or whatever. I won't go into the details, but it can be done. You can take these data, but this is easy. This is, once you have this far, it's not very hard to apply the cost data. It's what cost accountants do all the time. You can allocate non-teacher costs, outside of class, and I won't go into that, but it's all doable. You could allocate the indirects if you want to, facilities on the basis of time utilization. You can do other overheads. This is what you do for A21, basically, or what used to be called A21, and you're getting overhead rates. And then you can also get tuition revenue from the enrollment data, average tuition revenue, gross and net of financial aid. Again, just to show that you can do this, and then you can calculate margin that is based on these underlying variables. It's a straightforward calculation. You can calculate the difference between revenue and cost on a departmental basis. You could actually on a course-by-course basis. And you have done it without without special surveys. And that's really important. There's a few you have to set up some allocation formulas and things, but it turns out that it's well within the state of the art to do that. And if you consult with faculty as you go along, you get some pretty reasonable results. So what I want to do now is just give you a brief example of how this worked. I'm sorry, there are some other available metrics you can calculate as well. Incremental cost per enrollment, that's, we all worry about if we add 100 students, what's going to happen to our costs? Well, there's an incremental cost calculation. And a very interesting little structural business here. If you add one student to a course, what's the incremental cost? Zip. It's a rare course you can't add one student to. You add 100, it's something else again. And you'd like to quantify that. And in order to quantify that, you have to make some assumptions about the probability of different numbers of students. And so what this diagram shows is this is up until you get up until the course is full. Here you have to add another section, another section, another section, and then I won't dwell on it, but you can sort of make an assumption about how many students do you think you will have? Will it be a lot of students? Will it be a few? You can put in, this is that decision-making under uncertainty business. You can put in, this is called an exponential distribution, and you can put that in. It has a mean, the expected number of students. Anyway, you could put it in, crank a little math, and out comes the number for incremental cost. Not perfect, because it all depends on the assumptions, but it's doable, and my belief is it will prove once we get used to using it to be rather helpful. You can also get capacity utilization. You can get student attrition, as I mentioned. You can get exception reporting. You can do this on a course-by-course basis, and imagine, I first saw this sort of thing 15 years ago up in Missouri at a small little campus. A dashboard is showing, here's the normal range of on a given variable. There's a critical point. If you go above that, you got a potential problem, and you just can't go above this one. So you can have a dashboard with even symbols if you want, green, yellow, red, if you're above or below. So you can get some very nice displays, and then anything else really that you can get at the level of individual courses. Fail rates I mentioned. Sometimes faculty, as have worked in quality assurance with WASC, for example, on occasion. Ralph Wolf there is a good friend. You go into departments and you do find that faculty do have some quality measures at the department level, and you can put those in if they're available. Anyway, I want to describe the results of a pilot test. 3 volunteer departments, major public flagship university, a very large university, a very large state, not California, east of here. That covers a certain amount of ground. This pilot was studied by funded by the Lumina Foundation and NCHMS, some of you may know, National Center for Higher Education Management Systems assisted in this. And importantly, it was Lumina contracted with the Public Agenda Organization out of New York, an independent not-for-profit, to evaluate the results, which is always a good idea when you're trying something new. So there's a lot of numbers. I won't go through them in detail, but basically, this is an example of a very simple kind of course category scheme. You got with breakouts and without breakouts. Without breakouts, this university categorized in their timetabling whether something was a lecture, which meant anything that wasn't a lab or a seminar, basically. And then we just processed the data. These are very large classes, medium, small, just on the basis of some breakpoints that we specified in the data processing. Up here, these are the variables that we pulled out And this is all for the primary sections. There's another one for the secondary sections, but to keep it simple, just primary. So we can look at the number of courses represented here, the number of different teachers, the number of different faculty members who are doing the teaching, because we had the faculty IDs. Didn't have to report those out, but we knew what they were, so we could look for duplicates. The number of sections, the hours per week that, that each section met, the average class size, because we had the enrollment. We also could, because we had the room information, we could get the capacity utilization, and some of it was not so good, some of it was getting up there. Business people took a rather keen interest in that. And other staff, the adjuncts in effect, the number of other sections, primary sections taught by other staff, and then the average attrition. So these are the data. This come out. A little, grunting to get the data processing, the IT to work, but then it comes out. And so this is just a couple of diagnostic pieces of information. This is the years 2008 through 2011. This is the fraction of lower division freshman, sophomore courses that were lectures, and these are lectures that didn't have breakouts. By these categories. Well, a couple of very quick things. Then notice that it's creeping up on the total number of lectures is going up. The large ones are going up at a steeper rate, but the next category is going up. This is the sort of thing that if that English department, if people had been watching this for that English department, would have been spotted 5 years before they began to realize there was a problem. And remember, this wouldn't just be a single department. This would be for all the departments. You'd be able to look. And you'd have a dashboard, and you'd have some red lights flashing if things were going outside of control limits or what you decided was a normal range. So this is there's examples, and you can sort of dig around in there and get other kinds of things as well. This just pops out once you have these data. This just pops out, and then you can look at them. This was the analysis I just popped in. This happens to be class size and attrition, and an interesting relationship is we all kind of figured that the larger classes produce more attrition, and it's not as statistically significant necessarily because there's quite a lot of variance. But this, again, is without any effort to refine it. This is just straight out of the data and plump it into Excel and calculate the trend line, logarithmic trend line. This is something that you get the primary sections taught by different faculty. I was amazed, and so were they, as it turned out, that the differences in teaching loads. These are full professors, these are associate professors, these are assistants. Each one each bar is a faculty member. These are your adjunct population. This I should have mentioned, this is a science department at this very large university, so it's a pretty good sized operation. So here this again popped out, and not violating anybody's privacy. You don't have to identify these people by name, although the department chairman turned out to be rather interested in that, and that was okay. These, for what it's worth, are the direct costs and the incremental cost, and I just show those to indicate that you could get that stuff. Notice that the incremental cost can be rather different than the average cost. And so if you are using average cost per enrollment, and remember, this is all calculated for the different course categories. And in principle, actually, it's calculable for an individual course, although you go nuts at displaying all the individual courses. But summarizing them into these categories takes that problem away. You really could go very wrong if you are using average cost as a measure of how your costs will change as enrollments change. So we did it, and we actually ran 3 departments at this university, one science, one social science, and one, well, I don't know whether you'd call it liberal arts, or it was kind of a quantitative. It was math, what the hell. This is not math. This is the science department. Anyway, public agenda came in, and this is what they said, and it was kind of interesting. they were skeptical. They interviewed all the faculty before the project started. They attended all of our meetings. They interviewed faculty after. The faculty were, the chairs, I mean, interviewed faculty chairs. Chairs were skeptical at the beginning, but within a few minutes, as we demonstrated data like I was just showing, it was somewhat more extensive, but basically it included these, but there were other slides as well. They were asking questions and finding that the information was pretty interesting to them. This is driving towards that thing we have to have multiple wins. Everybody's got to win. There's got to be something for everybody. In the words of the evaluator, the model provides answers to questions that are extremely important and yet are very difficult to answer in practical terms. The quotes are of the evaluator, the public agenda evaluator, not me. You wouldn't trust the principal investigator to make these judgments. This was independent for the foundation. Many of the important decisions that impact the productivity involve assigning courses of different sizes with different kinds of instructors for different categories of students. And then he pointed out that although the data needed exist in various places already, there was really nothing new here. It was all out there to begin with. Putting it into a form that can be dealt with effectively made all the difference. And this is a quote from Bill Gates at that annual meeting in Nashville. Technology is taking things that used to be separate and bringing them together. That applies to data in general, and it applies to this kind of model in particular. You're taking stuff that's already there, putting it in a form that people can use, and that is very important and very exciting. So where does it stand now? I'll be brief. There were 2 R&D streams, mine, that I've been working on for 5 or 6 years, ever since that experience 10 years ago, that I just described. And then there's an entity in Australia called the Pilbara Group that does campus-wide applications of something called activity-based costing, which in some ways in the US has a bad name because it's being done wrong. But in Australia, they're doing it right. They're doing it based on models like this. And I ran into them. I was lecturing at the Martin Institute at the University of Melbourne in Melbourne, Australia, and got introduced to them. And anyway, we've gotten together. And the 2 streams have the same basic structures and ideas. And this shows you how academic research can connect up to commercial research. Turned out it wasn't difficult to combine our 2 sets of concepts. That's already been done. So the result is there's a model now that's available and it can be used. It's still early days in the United States, very early, but they've got a dozen or so campuses using various versions of this in Australia. And their institutions, by the way, are not all that different than ours. It takes about 2 to 4 months. So it's not something that's pie in the sky. You can just go get it. And a little bird has been telling me that one of the UC campuses is considering installing this fairly soon, maybe with foundation funding. That remains to be seen. Or alternatively, campus can build this for itself. It's all out there in the public domain. And that's important, I think, in principle. The benefits, again, to summarize, this is from Marie, I never pronounce her name, Angiano, who is the CFO at Riverside, UC Riverside, and was in the UC President's office until earlier this year, and also was a consultant for the Gates Foundation. She wrote a paper, which some of you may have seen. It's cited at the bottom. These are the benefits that she cites, and I couldn't agree more. We talk quite a bit, so I guess not surprising we're together on it. Operational transparency, bridge building between finance and academic, benchmarking, improved resource allocation, and then for planning and predictive, the framework for long-range thinking, which it really does, and strategic planning, and a tool. And the possibility of a tool for departmental and school-level tactical planning is important, because what the chairs in this pilot were very interested in is how they could use it. And in fact, one of them insisted on a separate meeting that afternoon where we presented again to him and a couple of his people, and they were figuring out how they could use the model for their own purposes. So it was really demonstrated how something that was prepared originally for business purposes turns out to be extremely useful for the academics, and they are willing to use it, at least in that situation. And you can do what-if analysis. If we have a strategy, if we're changing numbers of classes and sections, changing numbers of faculty, changing teaching loads, we can do these calculations. And again, going back, the business of being able to summarize the data by different types of teaching method. Class size groups, different categories of teaching. And that, by the way, what you do there is you can make inferences about quality, as in the English department example. You know that steadily increasing numbers of large lectures in English can't be good in terms of quality. You don't have a good quality measure, but you can see the trends, and if you add to that attrition data and whatever else you could get insight. As we start building additional teaching methods, you can put online, blended, and so forth into this categorization scheme without any trouble. And that's the sort of the next frontier. But until you have the basic structure, you don't do that. You need to have the basic structure. And then, so the ability to do what-if analysis in that structure is extremely important. It changes the mindset of people. And you start, doing more with less is a kind of a black box. How do we do that? If you could start, say, well, if we did this, what would happen? And what are the knock-on effects, even in this simple model? And the models will get better as we go along. It changes the whole notion. And if you end up at the point where you can't do more with less, as in that English department, you have some facts. You could go in there and say, look, I've tried every possibility here. You to take the model and see what you can do. There's just no way. That it changes the whole conversation, and it's extremely important. Summarizing some more of the approach to implementation, uses the data that's already present, sharing preliminary results with departments, as in the pilot, that promotes the buy-in and gets faculty involved. That's how you bridge this gap. That's how you get over that wall between faculty, is you actually work together on a common problem. Because what happened again in the pilot, this happens in Australia now all the time, is faculty come in and say, well, I don't think that's quite right. And then the people working with the model say, well, okay, I didn't know. Let's figure out how we can fix it. And the faculty say, okay, well, let's fix it. And they do. And now you have a collaboration, shared activity. But very importantly, you need to have, if you're going to establish potential partners benchmarking, and great hope would be, is that within California, you can start sharing. You have a made-to-order situation for sharing these kinds of data. It would be immensely beneficial to everybody if you could start doing that. But you're going to need common data definitions and business rules. And I know that's possible because I've seen it done. I also know how difficult it is. I once participated in putting up the research, well, I was with the research libraries group at Stanford, or at least representing them when I was a vice provost. And one of the UC campuses used OCLC. I think it was Berkeley that used RLG, and UCLA. It was just very difficult to get together, but it is possible. It is possible, probably more now than it was then. So you need to have robust coordination from the outset, and that gets you to what can you do Monday morning, those of you who are in positions to influence this sort of thing, to get some work on this. It seems to me the first thing to do is to start getting the word out on various campuses, get descriptions, working with Marie and others who have had some exposure to this. That's the sort of standard stuff we do, lectures and presentations and training and so on. Then campuses have to decide, whether they're interested. It's a pretty top-level decision. I think it's a presidential or at least an executive VP level decision in coordination with a provost or chief academic officer. But it's not all or nothing. Campuses can opt in or opt out. But it's important to start, I think, with a vision of sharing. And then you'd have some sort of a task force for getting started, common definitions and so forth. This would be amongst the institutions that want to opt in at the beginning. And that's an incentive for opting in, by the way. You get to influence how it's structured. And then once you get the process going, you would need a permanent committee, an executive committee or some such thing to keep it coordinated. And so that brings us to the end of the presentation. Feel free to email me. I'll be around, by the way, through lunch and the first session this afternoon with the CFOs, then coming back for the reception, so we'll have a chance to chat. But don't hesitate to email me. I've got a 2-page description of this thing. If anybody's interested, I'll be happy to email it to you. And I am working, I've last a commercial here, I'm working on a book called Re-Engineering the University, How to Be Market Smart, how to be Mission-Centered, Market Smart, and Margin Conscious. And so I hope that when that comes out, you'll double my sales if everybody here. Anyway, thank you. So that's it. We still have half an hour, 35 minutes for questions, and the floor is open.
Here you go. Let's pass this back. If we
Thank you. I'm very intrigued by this model, but I'm curious, how do you approach normalizing data across disciplines?
It turns out that it's not as difficult a problem as one might think. Yes, I might have mentioned that. That's an excellent question, because that was obviously something that had to be considered right from the beginning. What you do is you start, the whole issue about the disciplines is in the taxonomy, the nature of those categories. And the categories don't have to be the same for all of the disciplines. But I think we should start by trying to see how much commonality there really is. And what I had up on the screen, that's pretty common. I mean, all of those definitions would work fine. Now, the interpretation of it is very different. You wouldn't want to do benchmarking, comparing math with history. Those comparisons wouldn't mean a whole lot. But certainly looking at history versus sociology or whatever, I mean, you pick it off, or different sciences. So the worrying about the disciplinary difference comes after you have gotten the basic categorization. And then you can always refine the categories for particular groups of disciplines. Once you have this structure, it's very easy to change. I mean, it's just a matter of tweaking the IT a little bit. So you can now explore and see what kinds of structures make sense for what groups of disciplines. And it is very important to do that over time. This is a disruptive innovation, though. We're serving the underserved, namely us. And so we don't always get it right the first time, but it has the capacity to evolve over time.
I was just curious, you said that at the end of the presentation, one of these campuses, that the chairs or deans asked for a separate meeting to talk about how they're going to use it going forward?
Right.
How are they going to use it going forward?
Pardon?
Did you talk to them?
Yeah, we talked to them.
I was just wondering, what kinds of things did they use and what did they do with it, I guess?
What they were particularly interested in was, first of all, the trends in those percentages by different types of classes and the average class sizes. They were spot on the English department problem. I mean, each one of them had had their own version of that problem. And they were hungry for plain data so they could see it quantified. Then they began digging a little further, and they were trying to figure out how they could, if one of the things that comes up, for example, is if we adopted a different kind of resource strategy within the department. For example, there's something called a barbell strategy. It turns out that a better managed department will have a certain number of large courses. Those are very economical, but they will offset it by a larger number of small courses. In other words, you can afford the small courses because you've got the worst of all situations is when they're all sort of in the middle, and they're all too big to be really interactive. Once you got to a certain level, you might as well have a larger, facilities allowing it. But so they were interested in that kind of strategy, and this model invites that. And in fact, we haven't done that at this instance. We haven't taken it to this next step at the institution, but we talked. It's clearly available in there as once you get the basic model in place. You can actually do some optimization and to try to do the trade-offs using a more powerful model. So that was the second thing, was how to develop more sophisticated, more powerful strategies. And the third, and I was surprised at this, but they were very interested in that distribution of teaching loads. And you would think that a department chair would know that, just kind of instinctively, or it would be part of, every quarter you'd kind of know that. They didn't. I mean, they had some notion of that there were some outliers, but to see it arrayed like that, and that's so one of the things that was, well, I wonder what's going on there. And of course, looking at the actual data, you can drill down and find out the individual's names. And if you're within the department, it makes sense to, the data, it's the department's data. You could do that and find out what's happening. And there were two things that sort of immediately started the conversations, changed the conversation in two ways. One was, well, these are very different. And we have this cultural notion that we should all be more or less the same. Fairness, well, then and so, boy, this doesn't seem, fair. But then they started, well, I wonder, the second step in the conversation was, I wonder whether the people who have the low, have consistently high research loads. And it's easy, by the way, if you have academic year offsets on a grant or contract to take care of, to look at that. But then the next step is, well, they may be with NSF or somebody that doesn't pay for academic year offsets, but you can still see what it is that they have, that they're a PI on. So that was the next stage. And then the final stage of the conversation, well, I wonder if some of the people with low loads, and by the way, that diagram would come every year. I mean, you could get it for each year. I just showed it for 1 year. I wonder if people with consistently low loads still are productive. And I've had, to be honest, not as part of this pilot, but I've looked at those data at other places over time. And what you tend to find is people were productive on research once, and they got a certain pattern, and then they stopped being as productive. Didn't happen all at once, and there was some adjustment, but not enough. A hysteresis is what the engineer would call a hysteresis curve. You apply magnetism, and then you take it off, and you do not end up back where you were. So and nobody was, again, these were chairs. They weren't going to just make arbitrary changes. But it gave them a little something to talk with people about, something that was evidence-based, and evidence-based conversations with faculty generally work fairly well. Not always, but generally. And that's what you have to do to make progress. So anyway, those are just some examples of it. The business people were very worried about costs. But to know that the costs came from this underlying structure was very comforting to them, because they could go and, I mean, what happens in Australia. They go in and they report costs in the aggregate, but then people ask questions. Well, they can go down and they can drill right down as far as they want to go. You want to know about science? Well, let's talk about science. and you can find out, things at a level of granularity where you can be convincing. You don't have to be waving your arms in front of legislative committees and things like that. Not that we would ever do that. And so just the ability to build this up from the bottom made a big difference in the confidence that the business people now in Australia have that are using this sort of stuff have in their data. Questions? Yes.
Well, thanks very much for making math fun this morning. Actually really enjoyed it. At the beginning of your comments, you made a very provocative statement challenging us to be revolutionaries in helping reinvent higher ed. The tool you've presented seems to be really good as an engine for optimization.
Yep.
So can you talk a bit about the bridge between optimizing and revolutionizing?
Yes, wonderful question. That's great. Well, I must admit I haven't thought about it quite in those terms, but I want to. This is next book. No, this book. It's, read chapter 1, the new chapter 1, revised after today. It's written. It's written. That's all right. No problem. The way in which I believe a revolution has to take place in an industry, and pardon me for using that term, but I'm an economist, what can I say? An industry like higher education is that there is so much sunk cost, if you will, or better yet, embedded capital in our institutions of higher education, what I will call our traditional university system. And I've had a lot of conversations with the founders of Coursera and the other stuff like that, and they want to blow. And there are some people in the political spectrum out there that want to blow the system up and start again. And I argue very strongly against that, not because I particularly want to defend the status quo. I don't, as perhaps you've sensed, but because I believe that we have so much embedded capital that from a social standpoint, to blow it up and start again, the losses would be horrendous. And as in all revolutions, there are unintended consequences. I think one of the consequence, unintended but not unexpected, I think, would be a lot less face-to-face contact between faculty and students. And I believe that I have a grandson who has just completed an undergraduate degree purely online at Western Governors University, which is not a bad place. And I've watched over his shoulder as he struggled away on that. He was doing that because, well, it's a family matter. But anyway, he's late in life, getting relatively late getting to do it. And it's a very good process, but it's lacking something. And so I'm trying to get him on a campus now for a graduate program. But anyway, that one of the unintended consequences would be, well, let me just back off for a second. In learning, what we're learning about learning, the theory of learning theory, and service science, which is another aspect of this thing, is that it is a joint effort between provider and recipient of a service. And we call that in our industry active learning. That it is the job of the faculty to make sure that students process, or, and not make sure, that's too strong, facilitate, motivate and facilitate students to become actively engaged in the learning process. And a really effective teacher will do that. And a really ineffective teacher will not do it as well. And unfortunately, we have far too much of that. So what I fear is that we would basically industrialize the learning process. And that works fine up to a point. But I think we would, in terms of educating citizens and in terms of educating people for future life, I think we would fail to engage students at a level that really produces the kind of deep learning that we want. Oh, they will learn certain maths, and they will learn certain engineering concepts, and they will learn certain accounting concepts, and so forth. But they will not mature as individuals the way we would like to see them mature. Now, it certainly is true that our campuses, as they have evolved, do not do that job well for all students, the maturation of what I was just saying. And in fact, if I go back just a step, when you think about the expansion of higher education after World War II, basically what we did, we took a system that had, I'm a little vague on the numbers, but say a 5% participation rate or an 8% participation rate prior to the World War II. And because of the GI Bill and then everything that came after, thank goodness it came, it was a wonder. But we took the basic approach to teaching that existed for a participation rate of, say, under 10%, and applied it to a participation rate of, what is it, 60, 70? you pick your number. And it scaled up well for some students, but not for all students. And we also superimposed research big time on the system, which was another set of issues. So what the technology now allows us to do, IT, is to reach a much higher proportion of those students, the students that are on our campuses, with deep interaction. But because they are on our campuses, we still can reach them at the teachable moment in their learning process. We can reach them with interaction, with faculty interaction, direct faculty interaction. And so in effect, this oversimplifies, but the stages of learning are generally regarded as first exposure, new materials, processing. Students learn to connect it up to stuff that's in their brains already and think about it, get deeper. And then there's an evaluation phase and feedback and so forth. Well, when you think about it, we use our most scarce and resource, our faculty, to lecture, to provide first exposure. And, you may disagree with this, but it is just possible that not every student reads the homework before the lecture diligently. I mean, I don't want to overstate the case, but not here. No. It couldn't happen here. Anyway, the point is, students have learned over time. This has been decades long in the making. And the more effective the lecturing, the less need there is to read the material. But then you have to do more. You have to cover more. And so it's basically, it has cut out a lot of the interactivity, which in theory was being done before the lecture of the student, but it doesn't. Anyway, we need to turn that process around, and flipped classrooms and so forth. There are ways to do that, but there are many ways. Anyway, you can do a lot of things to solve the problems of learning that we are now learning, understanding greater. And you can do, technology helps you do a lot of those interactive stuff. But you can do more of that with a non-campus student than you can with a strictly online student, because you can have the best of both worlds. There's a principle in thermodynamics, I think it's called. I first learned it from Paul Samuelson in economics. It's called the generalized Le Chatelier principle. Don't ask me to spell it. And it basically says you can do better without constraints. You can do better, you can do better without constraints than you are able to do with constraints. Removing constraints allows you to do better. Well, there is an inherent constraint in an online environment of the inability to have the bandwidth that's reflected in face-to-face conversations and all the benefits of those. So why impose that constraint, and why? Anyway, I'm rambling a little bit, I guess, but yes, you agree. But the point is that what revolution is, to go back to the question, what revolution is to apply the new teaching and learning methodologies, technology-based, but not at the exclusion of face-to-face, in a way that is as effective as possible to produce learning, as much learning bang as you can for the resources available. And to do that, we must start by understanding what we do now, and then we have to move incrementally to find new ways. And blowing up the system and starting over again is not the way to proceed. So revolution is optimization, I think, in this case. And the models are seamless in that they allow the models will grow as the technology of learning grows. But without the conversations, without changing the conversations, history shows we don't change the way things are being done.
Thank you. So I'm really interested, you brought in and you started it at the departmental level. Mm-hmm. And so we're here with the president, and he buys in and says, I want to do this. Which department, and how would you get them interested? And then if they're in it because they have some control of the model, and how much flexibility would there be in the model?
Okay, good question. Well, it turns out that building a model like this is mostly an upfront fixed cost. That is, it involves doing the IT to extract the data from these transaction systems. So it really doesn't make any sense to say we're only going to model a certain department. If you're going to model, in principle, you have the data for at least the undergraduate, the major part of the institution, the arts and science. Medical schools, let's not talk about them at the moment, but the main part of the institution. Now, that doesn't mean you roll it all out at once. That would probably be a disaster. So what you do is you begin showing bits and pieces of it to faculty, and you'll find that departments will volunteer, or sometimes their deans may volunteer them, but they're basically departments that are interested in this sort of thing. That's how we got the test departments and the pilot study. And so you start, pardon the expression, with a coalition of the willing, and you learn from that. And so you do some customization for them, and then you take similar departments that other departments will be hearing about it, and so you roll it out step by step. Now, the question of customization is not unlike the business of sharing amongst institutions. That is to say, you start with a core construct, and it's flexible, so you can modify it. But there has to be some discipline, because if you allow every department to have its own set of specifications, then you can't do any comparison. So at that point, it becomes a negotiation. And the negotiations are evidence-based. I mean, basically say, well, we could try it this way, we could try it this way. Is there some commonality? And faculty, the departments will understand the need for comparing. They will want to compare, in fact. So providing some flexibility, but not too much, and that's, as I say, it's a process of negotiation.
A lot of people in the room are business officers, and I can't help but think that some of the deans and in the colleges will say, well, business officers, get your act together first, and then come tell us how to get our act together. Was that ever an issue?
Sure. Yes, definitely. And I hope very much that you are getting your act together. I mean, and that's why you're all here and so on. But it really doesn't make any sense not to give some thought to that part of the institution that is the major part of the institution, especially since it's in many ways easier than it is in some of your particular areas. There is a single model, there is a single approach, a point of view that can apply across broad spectrum of the academic operation. When you get to the business side of the institution, there are equally powerful models available in purchasing, in HR, and so on, but they're different. Purchasing is different from HR, as you well know, for example. And you can build models in student services, you can build models in housing, all sorts of things. And I trust you're doing all of that. But there isn't a single approach unless you consider it to be so broad as business process reengineering itself. But that basically, BPR is just a method of going and looking at particular operations and building an appropriate model for those, and then tweaking it and adjusting it, but it's a separate model for each area of reengineering. The academic side, you can treat it, at least to start, as a single entity, and even with the customization, it should stay a single entity at a certain core level so you get a core level of comparability. I've run into those comments, and usually they turn out to be. Well, just go away and leave us alone until such time, if ever, as you can demonstrate to me that your house is in order. And by the way, you never will be able to demonstrate that to them. So.
Any other questions?
Dr. Massey, thank you.
Thank you.
Fascinating presentation. I've got a question about the activities in Australia, how you've seen them progress down this path. I personally have been involved in this evolution in healthcare, watching evidence-based medicine take hold
Yep.
further through the industry and the presentation of data in non-threatening ways now used by clinicians to look at variations that lead to higher overall quality. If Australia has got some models that are more advanced than us or further down the evolutionary path, what lessons have they learned so far that you can bring back to us to help us in the conversations and to create that dialogue that we so need?
Yep. Okay, a couple of ways to answer that. Excuse me. First of all, the conditions precedent or the antecedents for the Australia experience is not, those aren't conditions I necessarily would wish on our institutions here. The Australian institutions have for a very long time now been much more highly regulated, much more constrained in what they can do by the government. There is a single national higher ed system in Australia. It's only nominal on a state-by-state basis. Mainly the action is in Canberra. And they have, over time, put in a succession of requirements for reporting things that are generally more onerous than what our institutions typically encounter. And as one might expect, there was a lot of concern about that at the beginning. Now it is pretty well accepted. And so in effect, and nothing bad has happened really. I mean, their institutions are still thriving and their faculty are still independent and they're still doing all the things that, we want faculty to do. And their research, is still going great guns. They don't have as much as we do, but then again, they're not as big and rich a country as we are. But the sky has not fallen. And over time, that has become kind of embedded in the culture, the academic culture in Australia. So now you go talk to vice chancellors, the president equivalent, and the pro-vice chancellor academics and the deans, you're much more likely to get a spark of a conversation that sort of meets halfway what we were talking about today. They are kind of automatically and intrinsically interested. I mean, it's an innovation and it takes some effort and concern and so forth. But the ground is more fertile. People, academic as well as business people, have come to realize that it's important to understand costs. So, and to understand costs appropriately, it's important to understand activities, namely what's being done on the ground. And that wall that I spoke about has been eroded to a considerable, not entirely, but to a considerable extent in Australia because of this particular history. And my guess is that's happening here too, will happen. I mean, it's what we're talking about today is helping make it happen. And the old saying, it happens to be true that universities are now much too big and much too expensive for what for years, when I was at Stanford, I mean, this was the mantra. Basically, we understood to the outside world, to the stakeholders on the outside, be it government, be it whatever, the political system and so forth, is we understand this stuff, you don't. You try to intervene and you're going to muck it up. My boss, Don Kennedy, the president of Stanford, used to say, just leave the money on the stump when darkness comes, and it won't be there in the morning, but don't worry, we'll have it. That hasn't now worked in the public sector for quite some time. So you can take the interventions as they are occurring, and so the challenge is not to find a way not to respond, but to respond in a way that is constructive and helps them. Their needs are legitimate. They have constituents like the rest of us. They have tight budgets. So to get at the root of the issue, and coming back to what I talked about this morning, it's not the model really. The model is just a means to an end. To understand what is going on with the teaching function and what its implications are for quality and for cost. And to do it in a way so you can have a conversation with the outside stakeholders as well as the inside ones that at the end of the day is constructive and leads to change that makes sense and frankly heads off that demand to blow the system up and and start putting people in MOOCs or concentrate, or contract it out to the University of Phoenix or wherever the market takes it. Universities should not be market driven. They have to be market responsive, but we march to a different drummer than the market, and a lot of people don't understand that. So if we want to defend all of those values, we really have to understand better what's going on at the core of our enterprise. And that's another reason that going back to the question about putting our house in order, the business house in order. The universities, I hate to say it, but do not exist to be efficient purchasers or efficient HR entities. You want to be those things. The universities exist to do teaching and to do academic things, research, scholarship, public service. And so you just, neither logically nor in practical terms do you dare to ignore that side of the enterprise. And you've got to have systematic data in order to intervene constructively. So, is it break time? Yes, it is. It's warm in here. Thank you.